By show of hands, who here maintains a large codebase? I don't know why my hand is up, I certainly don't, but I'm sure some of you watching along at home do. If so, then this is the talk for you. Your next speaker of the 2021 CityJS conference is Jack from London in the UK. Jack is a software engineer with Google, and in this session, Jack is going to be exploring some of the tips, tricks, and shortcuts that he's discovered over the years for maintaining large code bases, as well as exploring some of the strategies he implements for increasing code quality along the way. Fantastic stuff. Wherever you're watching along at home, please do keep the comments rolling in and get your questions at the ready for the Q&A session, which will be happening straight after this talk. Don't forget, keep posting along on social media using the hashtag CityJS2021. Jack, it is over to you.
Hi everyone, my name's Jack, and today I want to talk to you about lessons learned maintaining large code bases. The codebase in question that I want to talk about is the Devtools front-end codebase in Chrome. A lot of people don't realise, but this is HTML, CSS and JavaScript. It's just a front-end app just like any of the apps you're building. It just happens to be embedded inside of Chrome. And this codebase is large, not just because of the number of lines of code. There are over 150,000 lines of first-party JavaScript that we write. If you include third-party JavaScript, other dependencies we pull in, we're probably looking at 300,000 to 400,000 lines, but it's also large in the sense it's got a lot of history behind it. Devtools have been around in some form for over 15 years. There's been a lot of changes. A lot of different developers have come through the codebase and made changes. So there's a lot of history and a lot of work to try and figure out the context that changes were made in. And there's also pressure on making sure it's not broken. Not only do we want to ship stable Devtools to all our users, but every night it's deployed daily into the next Chrome Canary build, which updates every single day. And so for developers who use Canary, we want to make sure we don't ship a build that breaks their Devtools workflow. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is share some lessons I've learned or advice that I've found really useful for helping to deal with a large code base and making sure you can still build robust quality software with so many people making so many changes to just a lot of code. The first thing I found is that if it's not tested, it's probably broken. When you have an application that has a lot of code and a lot of different functionality, if all those bits of functionality don't have some automated tests behind them, whether that's unit test, end-to-end test, some other form of testing, there's a pretty high chance that it's going to be accidentally broken. No developer would ever break a feature on purpose, but just the amount of churn in the codebase means it's impossible to manually test every single feature. If you can't pick something up automatically, there's a really high chance it could slip through the net. On every change we make, we run a variety of tests. So here you can see we run unit tests, we have ESLint running, which I'll talk more about later on. We have end-to-end tests, and we have what we call interaction tests as well. These are all testing various parts of our software. What we like to do is if we find a bug, we like to see if we can actually prevent that bug from ever happening by adding a new automated test. So maybe there was a bug in some logic somewhere, we could write a unit test for that. Or maybe an important user journey broke and we could add an end-to-end test to make sure that it continues to function in the future. So try and make sure all your functionality is automated, but if you do get a bug, consider if you could add some automated checks in to make sure that bug doesn't appear again. Else there's just a really high chance that a developer working on a feature will accidentally break something without realizing. So when we upload changes, there's a lot of tests that get run automatically for us. We now use the TypeScript compiler, so we have TypeScript checking, does the codebase compile, are there any type errors? We have things like ESLint, making sure that changes are consistent and it's consistently formatted. We have unit tests to make sure the base functionality, or what some people like to call business logic, is working. And we also have the end-to-end tests, which actually load up the DevTools and click through it just as a user would. This lets us make sure that core user journeys aren't impacted. When there's a lot of people working on the same codebase, you want to be able to work without always conflicting with each other. So we like to think about isolating our codebase into what we call modules. What this does is it lets us work in small teams on the same codebase without constantly getting in each other's way. Imagine you have a codebase here represented by the lovely house, and you have different developers or different teams making changes into that codebase. This is the ideal picture. All the developers are happy, they're making changes, they're landing them into the codebase, and they can be productive. But we've all been there one day when you get a sudden merge conflict. Your change is ready to go, you're excited to deploy it, but you see that on the pull request, GitHub tells you that there's a merge conflict. Unfortunately, this is just a fact of life being a developer on a team. This will happen. We can't entirely rule these out, But what we can do is try and architect our code base to try and minimize the amount of times this happens. This makes you unhappy, it's unproductive, and it will also lead to some time. You'll probably have to go find your old code, pull in the new master branch, and then what you're going to have to do is rebase and fix those merge conflicts. This is also pretty risky. It can, depending on the merge conflict, be quite tricky to make sure that you've resolved it correctly. So what we like to do is we like to treat each folder in our application almost as a mini application in its own right. So for example, the console tab or panel in Devtools is completely isolated from, say, the elements panel or the network panel. A developer working on the network panel can do so in that folder without really worrying about any changes to any other folders. This isn't always possible, of course, and we do like to interact with our colleagues, and sometimes we do have to work together to fix problems or work on the same bit of code, but you don't want to be doing that all the time. You need to have small teams working on an application, being able to be productive without butting up against another team's work at all times. And continuing with the theme of lots of developers landing changes, if a standard isn't enforced, it won't be followed. What I mean by this is if you've decided on some convention that your team wants to follow, maybe the naming of files or single or double quotes or whatever it may be, if you don't automatically enforce that, it just isn't going to happen. Changes will slip through the net. As we saw earlier, there are a lot of developers making a lot of changes to the code base, so it doesn't take much for someone to accidentally land some code that doesn't match the formatting style. And if there aren't automated checks, it will probably slip through the net as well. So what you need to do is ensure that you've got automatic code that's enforcing conventions are followed. No developer doesn't follow conventions on purpose, but if you're working on a code base, or maybe the developers come from another company who's used to a slightly different style, it's very easy for that code to land. It's no good saying that we try to enforce that something is happening. You need to actually make sure you enforce that it's happening. Because else, with so many changes, these sort of things will slip through code review, and before you know it, you've got a consistently inconsistent code base. So this is where things like ESLint come in really handy. We use a bunch of ESLint's built-in rules to enforce the code style that we prefer. What I want to make clear here as well is I don't actually mind what these rules are. You and your team will probably have a different set of rules and preferences to the team I work on, and we could argue all day about which ones are better. It doesn't really matter what your rules are, it matters that you all follow them and that they are enforced when you make changes. You can also lean pretty heavily on ESLint custom rules. ESLint's API is pretty good, and it's a really good way to enforce very niche specific rules that don't exist as general rules but can be applied to your code base. So for example, we wrote a custom rule to make sure that each file has the right license header in at the top of it. This is a really good example of a rule that otherwise is just really easy to forget about. I'm not in the habit of adding license headers to my files automatically, sort of without thinking. At least I wasn't when I joined the team. And so to be able to hit save in my editor and have ESLint tell me that I've forgotten the license header really helps and saves me a lot of time. Then we have what we call pre-submit checks. These run as a Git hook. So when we do git push to push our changes up ready for code review, we have a bunch of rules that get run then. These are check things like our i18n generated strings are up to date, all our localization is correct, things like that. And then we have some general housekeeping admin type rules as well. Does the change list, which you can think of as a GitHub pull request, it's just the sort of Google Chrome DevTools terminology, does the change have a bug associated with it? We like to make changes that attract against bugs so we can keep track of our work and what we're doing. And also, so if you come back to a change that landed 6 months ago and you need more context, you can click through to the bug and find out more information. Anytime you have conventions like this, such as making sure each change is associated to a bug or making sure your ESLint rules are up to date, try and automatically enforce it, because else there will be issues and things will slip through the net. This brings me neatly on to my next point about thinking about your code review and how you can enable a really effective code review by automating things away. I've spoken a lot so far in this presentation about tools like ESLint, and that's really no coincidence. Automating things that can be automated has been a really good way to let me as a developer focus in on the things I can do best. This is that screenshot from earlier of an example of all the things we check. You can see here there are 16 steps. Some update the code, then we compile it, we check TypeScript, there's no issues. We do unit tests, we run ESLint, and there's other things we do as well. These are all things that a computer can do far better than I as an individual can do. The way I like to think about this is imagine you're reviewing a pull request and you've got an option of 1 or 2 comments to make. You're thinking about leaving a comment on a pull request that says, I would prefer this to be indented by 3 spaces, not 2. And you've left another comment on the pull request that says, hey, what's the reason for calling event.prevent default there? I'm finding this code hard to follow, so it might be worth exploring alternatives. Just take a moment to think, which of these comments do you think could have been automated by a computer? Now, the indentation rule, regardless of if you think 3 spaces is better than 2, is definitely one that we could have handed off to a tool like Prettier, a code formatter, or ESLint to enforce particular coding styles. This is not something that you as a developer should be thinking about in your head when you're reviewing code. And the reason is, if I'm going through a code that you've asked me to review, and I'm thinking about things like, have they formatted it correctly? Is everything indented correctly? Are you using single quotes, not double quotes, semicolons, and so on? That means that I'm not thinking about the important things like, this particular block of code is quite hard to follow, or I don't really understand this logic, could we tidy it up or leave some clarifying comments? When it comes to code review, let the computer do what it's good at so you can focus your review on what you're good at. Computers are great at doing automatic checks. They can check code is formatted consistently. They can make sure all the tests are passing. They can make sure files have the correct license headers. They can make sure that any code coverage on your unit test isn't negatively impacted by a particular change. And they can check things like files follow a given naming convention. These are all things that you should not be thinking about in your head when reviewing a colleague's code, because you should know that the computer is going to do that for you. Once you do that, it frees you up and it frees your brain up to think about the important things. Is this architecture going to cause us problems in the future? These are the sort of questions that a computer can never answer, but you as a developer with experience working on that code base can. So if you find yourself doing a code review and not thinking solely about the architectural approach your colleague has taken, or the way the naming of functions say, or the way they've structured things, and instead you're thinking about their formatting, offload that to a computer. Not only does this free you up to think about the important things, but it's also going to save you a lot of time. Say your colleague uploads a change and then you leave some comments about formatting. They then got to read those comments, make the formatting changes, push that change up again and ask you to re-review. If all those things are done automatically, then hopefully you can shorten that cycle between initial code upload, review, and then landing that code and deploying it live. Another thing that we found challenging on the large code base is that there's only so much you can plan. I don't want to be misunderstood here. That doesn't mean you shouldn't plan. You should continue to plan your work, but there are just more unknowns as the code base grows in size. If you're a bit more interested in this topic, me and 2 of my colleagues did a talk at this at Chrome Dev Summit last year called Upgrading Devtools' Architecture to the Modern Web. I'll leave a link here and the slides will be available as well. But here we go into much more detail about how we plan large migrations that took literally years to build and run. When you're working on a new change, maybe a code migration or landing a new feature, is not going to be smooth sailing up and to the right all the time. You might start and get really good momentum because you land your first change, but then you'll hit an unexpected blocker, or you'll find a bug that was fixed 10 years ago that is now suddenly causing you problems, or you'll find that the code that someone wrote 5 years ago doesn't deal with this new edge case that you have to work on. So it's not going to be a straight up and to the right graph. It's not all going to be smooth sailing. There will be lumps and bumps in the way. What you have to do is really balance here planning versus doing. It's important to plan and have a sense of how you're going to build the feature or the migration that you want to do. But at the same time, if you spend all your time planning and don't spend enough time diving into the code base, you could find that you make this perfect plan that is immediately undone by a small edge case in the code that you weren't able to think of ahead of time. Equally, if you don't do any planning and you dive in, you're probably going to do it in the wrong way. You're not going to get the best approach first time, and it's probably going to take you longer. Every project and every code base, this sort of seesaw and this balancing act, it will be in a slightly different position. But on the whole, you still want to plan, but you need to accept that there will be unexpected roadblocks. And sometimes these are roadblocks that you'll be able to then plan for in the future once you've hit them. And sometimes you just have to get a bit frustrated and accept that you couldn't have spotted that by planning. And it's just part of the job that you now have to deal with this unexpected roadblock. That brings me on nicely to this point that you have to be flexible to changes. There's just so much going on that you cannot keep this whole code base in your head. And that means that when you're planning a feature, you will inevitably forget about little things that you need to remember and deal with. This will probably happen less as you work on that code base more and you build up that experience and knowledge in your head, but you do have to be flexible and accept that your projects are going to hit unexpected issues. These can be good or bad. Sometimes it might be that the networking module uses a different back-end communication system, so that means that our migration plan is now null and void. We can't migrate in the way we thought we could, and so now we're going to have to go back to the drawing board and revisit. And sure, that is really frustrating, but you should also see that as an opportunity to figure out a better way to do it and also understand how you could have solved that problem ahead of time and found it when you were planning. But sometimes you're going to find that these actually go in your favor. It turns out the elements panel doesn't use that buggy method, so the impact isn't going to be as bad as we feared. You have to be a little bit flexible and ready to change your plans as you learn and as you find things out as you're doing the work. This also means that estimating can be hard as well. Things take time and it's quite hard to pin down specifically. We've got to the point now where we don't really estimate anything less than weeks, because there's no point estimating shorter than that. It's just hard to be accurate and it's not really very useful. Instead, what we do on a quarterly basis is that we plan things out and we leave some headroom in there for the unexpected hurdles. One of the migrations we did and completed recently, which migrated our codebase to TypeScript, the initial estimate for that I think was a few months, and it ended up taking over a year. Similarly, our modernization work to move the codebase to use ES modules also ended up taking over a year, and the initial estimate was a few weeks. Estimating is really hard, and so you have to have a bit of leeway and you have to accept that things are going to take longer because there is more code, there's just more edge cases, there's more things to deal with. And you think about all the things you have to deal with in any given change. You've got the people working on that change, you've got the teams that are around us, you've got all the features in this application, you've got all the bugs, you've got all the lines of code, and you've got the risk associated with all of these things. There is just a lot to consider, and as the codebase grows, there are more people, there are more teams, there are more features to maintain, there are more bugs to fix, you've got more lines of code, and therefore you've got more risk. So if I were to sum up what it's like working on large code bases, we do as much work as we can to reduce the risk. That's the most important thing we do. We plan thoroughly, but we're willing to be flexible when we need to be. We automate as many checks as we possibly can to make sure we're shipping functionally good code. And we make sure that teams are able to be productive by working on isolated modules as much as possible, but also being very happy to jump on calls and collaborate when we need to. We also document extensively. As I said, there's just so much information in a code base that's old and has a lot of code that you cannot keep it all in your head. So we have a lot of documentation to point people to, and this comes in really handy for everyone, but especially for new people joining the team. Having these reference docs available is a really good way to make sure that people can try and get up to speed and productive sooner rather than later. So with that, I'd like to finish. Thank you very much to the conference organisers for inviting me to partake and give a talk. I hope you enjoyed that. If you do and you want to hear more about me, you can head to jackf.io/blog to find my blog posts. I podcast a podcast called Fish and Scripts, and I'm Jack_Franklin at Twitter. And there's a link there to the slides where you'll find all the links to the YouTube video and other talks I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Jack, that was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with the CityJS conference audience this year. It sounds like you had a lot of painful experiences working with large, monstrous front-end code bases, but your pain will hopefully alleviate some of our audience's future pain. To show their appreciation, I'm sure everyone around the world will be joining me for our Round the World round of applause. Our final Q&A of the day with Jack will be starting over on GatherTown any moment now, so head on over there if you have any questions about maintaining large code bases or working on front-end projects with loads of other developers over a long time period. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll be a large code base. If you aren't on GatherTown, let us know what you thought of that talk on social media using the hashtag CityJS2021, as well as on YouTube in the comments section. That's nearly it for today. We have one session left with Expo, which is with Samuel, but that's it from me for today. So enjoy this last session, sleep tight, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next day. Adios.
I always think he looks like Harry Potter. Jack, what a fantastic talk. Thank you for being a part of this year's conference lineup. It's been absolutely a pleasure to have you as part of it.
Thank you for having me.
It is our pleasure. And we've had a couple of questions come in, so I'm going to skip the preamble and we'll get straight down to it. So this one comes from Andre, our key questioner of the day. You mentioned pre-submit Git hooks. Do you use Husky to define those Git hooks, or do you author them in another fashion?
We use something else. I don't know where it came from. There was already set up in the codebase when I joined the team, with just a custom sort of Python script that we use. But really, to all intents and purposes, it works in exactly the same way as Husky. You type, git push, and it runs the check. So it's basically the same. It's just sort of thing that was built by an engineer on the team a while ago that we still lean on today. So we don't use Husky, but we could as well use Husky. It would serve the same purpose for us.
Do you think they would be a straightforward swap to go from your library to Husky?
Some of them would be. The thing that would probably keep us with our infrastructure is that a lot of the checks, the pre-submit checks, as we call them, are shared between different code bases. So they're all sort of defined in one place, and then we can just pull in the checks that we want. So theoretically, no, but we probably have to reinvent a few checks and pull them into Husky ourselves that otherwise we just kind of get as part of the other code bases. So no real reward for us to do that, to be honest. But there's not that there's anything wrong with Husky. It's just slightly different approach, but same result.
Okay, well, that's the important thing, isn't it? The results, more than
Yeah.
anything else, right?
Yeah, it catches all my errors, so that's the main thing.
That's it. That's the important thing as well.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned a bug fix from 10 years ago, how do you handle git commit message? As in only subject, or do you enforce filling the body too?
Good question. We don't enforce filling the body, but it would be unusual not to have sort of some information in there, or it would be certainly something if I was asked to review a change that I felt didn't have enough information in the commit message or the description, I would ask the author to add more context there. The one thing we do try and enforce is each change will have a link to a bug that is associated with that change. So if I'm fixing a bug report, I'll link to the actual bug on the crbug.com, which is our bug tracker. Or you can also do this nice thing where you can put like fixed and then the ID of the bug, and it will mark that bug as closed in the bug tracker for us as well. And I think one of our sort of Husky equivalent checks does check that you've assigned or associated a bug to the change. So that's sort of how we do it. And that's really nice because then if you come across some code and you find the original pull request where that code landed, you've then always got a link to the bug or to some more context. So we enforce bits, but generally I think most of the time you will find our changes have quite reasonable descriptions associated with it. Because I think we've all been there when we're trying to figure out like, why on earth did the developer do this? Like even why on earth did I do this a year ago? And you want as much context as you can. I think we've all been bitten by not leaving good commit messages in the past. Yes. So we try to avoid it now.
Yes, definitely have. Do you provide, like, as a company, as an organization, is there really, what am I trying to say here? Do you provide training on writing good commit messages, or by the time people work with you, are they already at that point where they're making useful commit messages? Because in my experience, there's some good ways to do it and there's some bad ways to do it, right?
Yeah, I don't think we have any specific training. I think you would potentially get feedback as part of the code review on the description. So just the way our UI works for reviewing code, it will pop up the description almost like it's a file that you've uploaded as part of that change. So it's very easy for me to say, highlight one sentence in your description and say, could you please like rephrase this? This doesn't quite make sense to me. So that's really as much as it takes. I think on the whole, most people are quite good. In some projects, we do sort of follow like a standard Git commit convention system. In others, we don't. But on the whole, yeah, you would just get feedback as part of your sort of code review. And yeah, most people are pretty good at it or get into the swing of it pretty quickly.
And I think that's probably the best way. I mean, training on writing Git commit messages would be tedious, should we say?
Yeah, well, maybe not the most enjoyable training you'd ever attend.
So we've had another question here from Charilios. I'm butchering some names today, I promise you. Charilios. You'll recognize the question anyway. You mentioned keeping each folder as a mini application, and that makes it not that easy for having conflicts often. Well, that makes it easy to not have conflicts often.
Yeah.
Can you go a bit deeper into exactly what you mean about that? So folders as applications.
Yeah, sure. So on our team, we've got maybe 4 or 5 sort of smaller teams of developers working on a particular area of the Devtools. So if you picture the Devtools, you've got all the different tabs or panels. So you've got like console, elements, network, and so on. There's about 20 of them, I think, maybe even more. And so what we try to do is, if you've got a particular team focusing, let's say for one quarter, they're focusing on improving, adding some new feature to the elements panel. What we want that team to be able to do is work without being sort of almost like interrupted or disturbed by another team who are also working on a different part of the code base.
Okay.
So they can land changes in the elements folder, and by and large not have sort of Git conflicts or have to deal with issues that other teams might have made similar changes in that area. So really it's about just trying to keep people productive and not have to always hit roadblocks in terms of Git commits, or just like two teams working the same area going in slightly different directions. Stuff like that you want to avoid as well. So it's not that, I don't want to make it sound like we never talk to each other or we don't collaborate across those teams. Obviously there's a lot of shared code underpinning all of the individual panels, but it's more just, we've got this team of 2 or 3 developers working on feature X for this quarter. Let's try and make sure they can sort of focus in on that and have each team focus in on the thing that they happen to be focused on at the moment. And so we found that by basically mapping the UI to folders, so you look at the elements panel, that's a folder, you look at the console, that's a folder, and that has helped us do that. And if I have to load up the elements code to fix a bug, I don't need to worry about anything else within Devtools. So it also helps me focus in terms of bug fixing, because I can just, the Devtools is quite a big code base. And if I can just load up the elements folder and not have to think about any other code, then that means there's less code for me to get my head around in order to hopefully fix the bug.
That sounds like a very good way to do things. It sounds like it solves a similar problem to that which micro front ends addresses, in that keep the team rolling at all times so that there's no blocking changes, if you like.
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty similar. It's also kind of like if you've ever worked on like a component, sort of an application built out of components, whether that be like React or even web components. If you've loaded up a component to fix a bug, one of the benefits of using components is that you only have to focus in on that component, because each component kind of does one thing and does its own thing. And so it's the same kind of thing, just on a slightly bigger scale. You could kind of think of the elements panel as a component that just happens to have quite a lot of stuff in it. So it's all about collaborating when you need to, but also being able to get your head down and focus in on the exact problem you're trying to solve, and do so productively.
Okay, interesting. So we're going to take a segue now, because we've not got too much time left. So I want to segue off a little bit. I see you've got a little trophy in the background there.
Oh wow,
Premier League winner.
It was, I think, what was it? It was player of the season for a work 7-a-side football league. It's not much to shout about. It probably says a lot about me that I've got that on display, Tony, to be honest with you. It's
hey, look, you celebrate your victories no matter what they are.
Absolutely.
Right? That's cool. Pardon me. So one of the things I was interested to know purely for myself is, how do I do your job? How do I get to where you are in terms of transitioning? Because I would imagine you were a front end or back end engineer at some point, and you ended up working with DevTools. Was it a natural transition?
For me, yeah. So I was a back-end developer and then moved more into front end, almost by accident, because the company I was working for at the time had a real shortage of front end developers, and I happened to sort of have done a fair amount of front end. And then from there, really, I found for me that I have always enjoyed working on tooling and sort of tools for other people to work on, rather than maybe products. And so really, it just, when I found there was an opening on the DevTools team, it was just a natural fit for me to go for. It's still engineering. It's a lot of front-end engineering, for sure. But it also, for me, is building tools to help other developers hopefully achieve more, or have a better day, or fix a bug quicker in their own websites. So yeah, it just felt like a natural fit for me, really.
Okay. So I follow Christian Heilmann online. Obviously, he's doing a lot with the Edge DevTools at the moment.
Yeah.
Is there any peeking over the wall at what the others are doing and going, "Oh, that's a good idea, we'll steal that"? Or do you kind of imagine things from scratch on your team?
A bit of both, really. I think any sort of sensible person looks at what their sort of other people in that space are doing, and particularly with the Edge DevTools, they also are built on top of the Chromium DevTools. So we've collaborated fairly heavily with Microsoft on, I think, the Flexbox tooling and the CSS grid tooling, and a few other things have kind of been a joint effort between Microsoft and the Google teams respectively. So yeah, we keep an eye on what others are doing, and I'm sure they keep an eye on what we're doing too. And I think it's ultimately it's good for developers, regardless of which browser they decide to use, if all the dev tools are being inspired or taking ideas from others and iterating on them. So it's a bit of us coming up with new things that we think are missing. It's a bit of us trying to make sure we support any new web platform features that are landing that we want to be able to let people work with and debug. And yeah, it's a bit of seeing what everyone else is up to and sort of taking inspiration from that.
Okay, so talking of inspiration, let's forget you've got any control, anybody controlling what you can or can't do. You know, you could release any dev tool into the world, put something in that pane for us developers to use. What would be your dream addition to the DevTools? And anything is possible.
That's a good and a very, very tough question.
That's why I'm here, my friend.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for immediately off the top of my head. I think in an ideal world, I think I'd like to maybe. I feel like the DevTools is really powerful. It packs a lot in, but I wonder sometimes if you're relatively new to developing in the front end and you pop open DevTools, you get all these different panes and panels and stuff that you know as a relatively new developer you don't even know what half of them are for. I mean, I don't know what half the panels in DevTools do, and so I wonder if there's a better kind of onboarding or workflow for beginners, or maybe like a power mode for like power users, for want of a better phrase. Something like that potentially would be sort of my thing. I spend quite a lot of time teaching sort of people how to code outside of work, and I think just having a slimmed down DevTools, like here's just the console and just the elements and just the CSS stuff would be kind of a nice thing to do.
Yeah, I think that beginners mode would be really, really useful. Thinking about DevTools now, I probably use about 20% of 20% of the panels, not what's in those panels, but 20% of everything. So yeah, I think that onboarding would be really, really good. So we are coming to the end of our time, and it makes me very sad. I think we could carry on chatting about DevTools.
Oh, absolutely.
But I do want to finish it off with our quick fire questions, which we've been asking everybody today. We're kind of polling the developer ecosystem to see what the standards are nowadays. So first up, the big one, tabs or spaces?
I'm a spaces person. Yeah.
Good. You're on the right side of that divide. TypeScript or JavaScript?
Oh, well, we've just spent the last year migrating the code base to TypeScript. So I think if I didn't say TypeScript, I'd be having some serious questions asked of me. So it's certainly TypeScript.
It sounds like begrudgingly TypeScript, but you don't need to answer.
No, well, you spend a year like migrating a big bit of software to it, and I think you'd be a bit fed up of it. But no, I love working in TypeScript, so I would go TypeScript.
Fair enough. And this one might be tricky for you, actually. Front end or back end?
That is a tough question, but I would have to go front end, as I spend most of my day just doing more front end things. I think, well, building on Brian's talk from before, and I think the ability now that we have with all the Jamstack and all that, those tooling I think the divide is going away slowly but surely. So front end, but with a keen interest in some back end stuff as well.
Okay, so we'll hesitantly say full stack, but with leanings to the front end.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Okay. Dino or Node.js?
Oh, that's a tough one. I've only done a sort of basically a hello world in Dino, so I'd have to stick with tried and trusted Node.js purely for my familiarity with it.
Okay, but it's something that's on your radar and that you're interested in. I like that.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Cool, and we'll finish it up with one last question. North or south of the Tamar?
South.
Yes. And to everybody watching along at home, I ain't got a clue what we're talking about.
No idea. No.
Jack, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll wrap this up any second now. But it just leaves me to say to everybody watching along at home, there is one session left today, I believe. There will be no further Q&As, so I will bid you farewell here. But please do return tomorrow, and don't forget to go and visit those sponsors if you have a few minutes. Until then, see you later.